Wellbeing has traditionally been all about tools, benefits, support owned by HR. A lot of it sits alongside the person who manages medical insurance plans. So a lot of the focus has been on support being about when things go wrong. A large amount of work that we are trying to do in StanChart is to change the focus. And we are talking about this idea that positive mental health can be a significant contributor to high performance and productivity.
Welcome to Lead From Within, the podcast for people leaders that explores the fascinating intersection of mental health, leadership, and performance.
Hello and welcome to Lead From Within, our first episode of 2024. I'm your host, Dr. Nick Taylor, and today I am thrilled to be joined by a truly exceptional guest. Tanuj Kapilashrami is the CHRO at Standard Chartered Bank. As an integral member of the bank's global management team, she's devoted to creating purpose-led experiences for around 100,000 colleagues in over 50 markets. Since starting her journey with Standard Chartered in 2017, Tanuj has placed a strong emphasis on leveraging technology and cultivating a culture of inclusivity to drive innovation and excellence. Tanuj is no novice, though, to finance and has garnered over 17 years' experience prior to Standard Chartered at HSBC, where she honed her skills in a wealth of HR disciplines across multiple markets, including places such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, India, and London. Beyond her role at Standard Chartered, Tanuj is making significant contributions as a non-executive director on the board of Sainsbury's. She also serves as a board member of the UK Financial Services Skills Commission and as a non-exec director at the independent think tank Asia House. On top of that, Tanuj also sits on the board of Autumn, an integrated digital wealth, health, and lifestyle solution startup. Tanuj, welcome, and perhaps you can start by sharing where you find all the hours in the day to do such an incredible array of things.
Nick, firstly, thank you. I wish you and everyone who is listening to this podcast a very, very happy new year and hope it's healthy and happy for everyone. It's great to be part of this conversation. And, I know as we talk about this further, we are going to talk a lot about the privilege of being able to do purposeful work. And I think I'm just I do genuinely feel very privileged to be able to involve myself with institutions and with people that are focusing on purposeful work and delivering impact in a big way. And I think a lot of my energy comes from that.
So Tanuj, that sense of kind of wanting impact and purpose, does that come from values that were part of growing up? Did that come from a family member or somebody you had seen in work that you felt, well, that's what I want to be doing? Or was it something that you found yourself?
Well, my family, I come from a family of academics, of people in public service, a lot of work my family members have done, my parents, my siblings in public policy, working in areas of work, which is the interface between public sector and private sector. So I do come from a family that has been focused a lot on academics, on delivering impact and this idea of public service. And, while it sounds antithetical when you talk about doing this job in a bank, a lot of the work that we do actually inside and outside is the idea of how do you deliver impact at scale that makes a contribution to the society. First by our employees, but actually to the larger ecosystem. Our customers, suppliers, our employees and their families. So this idea of delivering social impact at scale has been part of my upbringing.
Was it obvious, based on what you've just said, was it obvious to you as you were starting out in your career that working in HR and people functions was where you could have that maximum impact? Was it clear to you?
Nick, a lot of my career has been the interface of change, transformation, people strategy. And I've always sort of thought of my career as actually an intersection of all of these areas. I grew up pre-liberalized India, and the fact that in emerging markets, the biggest lever to capitalize on the opportunity would be the focus on education and skill building was something that got me into this profession. So I came into HR because I genuinely believe that as the world of work is changing, the gap between education and employability is becoming wider and wider, and the role that businesses need to play in bridging that gap. And I thought, being part of the people function, there is a real opportunity to be able to focus on building skills for the future of work. And that's been one of the key attractions of coming into the function.
You and I have had some great conversations over the years talking about, well, what does well-being mean? Why should organizations care about health? When you're talking about education and you're talking about development, what is the role of well-being in amongst that picture?
Well-being is often seen as something which is fluffy, difficult to quantify. You talk about well-being as a soft skill. For me, I've always had a very different view. I think well-being as a skill, and I talk about skills as technical and human, and I think well-being is a core human skill. And like any other skill, I think it can be learned, it can be developed, and it can be measured. And that's been my fundamental belief. And as you think about a future fit organization and a future fit workforce as part of our skills agenda and as part of the human skills within the skills agenda, we think of well-being as a core component of that.
So making it about you for a moment then, because that's such an interesting idea that isn't always spoken about as articulately as you've just outlined it. If well-being can be learned and can be a skill that's honed, then what have you personally done to learn well-being, and how do you manage the high demands of your workload with your own well-being?
Nick, one of the first things to realize is that for everyone focusing on their well-being, it's a very unique thing, right? And all of us need to figure out what are those opportunities that we have, which is sort of unique and personalized to us. And I'll come at it from an organizational lens. The organization needs to create an environment that people can focus on areas that are unique to them as far as their well-being, as far as their mental health is concerned, right? For me, something as simple as going to the gym a couple of times a week, being there for important occasions in my daughter's life, school concerts, school events, school plays. That's incredibly important, and being able to carve the time to do it, and to do it in a very present way. When you do it, you're doing it, and not as a tick box, and sort of being present in the moment. That's incredibly important. But it could be different for other people. I know we talk a lot about purpose. In Standard Chartered, we pride ourselves on having a very high number of employee volunteering days. Loads of our employees volunteer outside of work in areas of interest for them. And I speak a lot about that being important for people's well-being. So to be honest, finding that things that are unique to you is important. And it can be something, like I said, as small as going to the gym, or something impactful or powerful as being associated with an NGO that you volunteer with a couple of times a month. And the organization needs to provide opportunities for both those things.
Yeah, that level of personalization is critical, isn't it? Because we are all so different to one another. And actually, by celebrating and building on those differences, we build that kaleidoscope of perspectives within our organization, and therefore we are more likely, with that diverse, inclusive culture, to flourish. We stand here at the start of another year. You've referenced that well-being can sometimes be seen as kind of fluffy, and I totally agree. I think it has been mispositioned at points. But what would you say, looking back on the past few years, starting in the negative space, what have we been getting wrong when it comes to well-being?
Say it's getting wrong as much as, we've been on a journey, Nick. And again, well-being has traditionally been, and continues to be in large parts of the world, all about tools, benefits, support, owned by HR. In most HR departments, again, you and I have discussed it, it sits along with employee relations or benefits. A lot of it sits alongside the person who manages medical insurance plans, etc. So a lot of the focus has been on well-being tools and support being about when things go wrong and what is the support that we provide to people when things go wrong. A large amount of work that we are trying to do in StandChart is to change the focus. And we are talking about well-being at the positive end of the spectrum, and this idea that positive mental health can be a significant contributor to high performance and productivity, right? And even symbolically, inside the organization, who manages the well-being agenda is very, very important, right? I mean, the organization I inherited a couple of years ago, well-being was managed, like I said, as part of the benefits proposition and benefits program alongside medical insurance, employee assistance programs. We have moved the well-being agenda to be sitting as part of employee advocacy. And employee advocacy is about culture, it's about inclusion, it's about well-being and high performance. Just by changing the focus to make it much more about a critical lever in the business that builds a culture of high performance, productivity, and balances this idea of a productive, healthy, happy workplace has shifted the focus completely as far as the agenda is concerned. So the tools, benefits, programs are important, but the focus really needs to be about well-being in the flow of work. And I think that's where naturally the agenda needs to pivot to.
I totally agree with that. And I think I like to remind people that when you go and look at the World Health Organization definition of mental health, it talks about mental health as a human right. And yet most organizations have it as a benefit. It just doesn't align to actually how the topic needs to be understood. And I think the way you have structured the team in the way you've just described is incredibly inspirational and progressive. Did you have a battle to get it to that place, or was it, as soon as you spoke about it and articulated it, it was well understood and the rationale was totally supported by the other executives in the organization? How would others learn how to achieve the same outcome?
I think COVID first, for me personally, I can talk about it personally, was a real turning point, right? And while we were all dealing in various ways, your audience that listen to this podcast, I think COVID was a real moment of reckoning for organizations, and within that, the people functions. CHROs such as myself were put into a position where you were navigating the organization through this extreme crisis, sitting alongside your CEO, chairman, boards, etc. And it was during that period, the realization that we need to think about our employees as a stakeholder group in the same way that we think about customers, regulators, shareholders became very clear. So, obviously it was implicit in everything we did, but it became very, very clear that we need to think about employees as a stakeholder group in the same way. And we came up with this idea of setting up an employee advocacy function that thinks about employees as a stakeholder group from an end-to-end perspective. It's a very senior role, sits around my table. And that role, like I said, has everything that is into it. So, you've got inclusion and diversity, the whole focus on culture, how do we build real high performance? What does the culture of high performance feel like? Employee relations, and well-being. So the well-being strategy came under it. And this idea that we look at it as part of the continuous spectrum, and we think about it in terms of delivering that differentiated experience for our colleagues and making it bespoke. You spoke about the idea of lived experience. We need to, when I talk about well-being in the flow of work, it is recognizing that each of our lived experience is very different. And you cannot do it if you think about it just as a program that sort of sits on the intranet somewhere. You got to think about it in the context of lived experience of all of our colleagues. And once we took that view, it took me a while. It actually was quite interesting when I was searching when I had to search out for the head of employee advocacy. I had quite a few people calling me, including loads of headhunters, saying, Tanuj, I don't think people are going to really understand this job because, as a construct, it wasn't, and, it still is not a very popular construct. But But to me, that's where I think the focus needs to pivot. You need
Yeah.
to think about the end-to-end lived experience of your colleagues. And if you think about it from an end-to-end perspective, well-being is a critical part of the journey. But look, I think the head of employee advocacy in the bank today is a critical member, not just of the HR management team, actually a critical member of the bank. And some of the conversations that the board are having with the role and the management team members are having all around lived experience of colleagues bears testimony to how far this agenda has moved inside our company.
And I think it's incredible to hear. And that relationship between well-being and performance, I think if there's a hope of a theme for 2024 around this topic, I hope it's there, because it's so important that we start framing it in that way. We must move away from that stigmatized view of mental health and well-being either being a nice to have fluffy thing or just about problems, because the reality is it's about our people being able to operate at their best as well. We all know, for example, if you have a really nasty head cold, it's much harder to focus because you're not feeling very well. It's much harder to do your best work because we're not feeling very well. It's much harder to connect with other people. And we can so clearly see the relationship with our physical health and our performance. And the same is true with our mental health. There's a real opportunity to, like you say, work on our well-being and prioritize our health and well-being and reap the benefits of that in terms of how we can show up and how we can perform. And I think that link you're making between diversity and inclusion and the well-being agenda is critical as well. The overlap there is massive. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that topic has evolved and how you think about the interplay between well-being and diversity and inclusion.
It's absolutely critical. And a lot of the work that we are doing under employee advocacy is around the theme of psychological safety. And the idea that high levels of psychological safety lead to sustained high performance. And, we did a really interesting piece of work, because a lot of times people tell me, or the cynics tell me, Tanuj, of course you'll have a psychologically safe environment if everyone's nice to each other, people are polite, people are not being tough, people don't have a fear of, challenge coming in the company. And actually, we did a piece of work which said that's not true. Ultimately, high level of psychological safety come from respectful workplace relationships, skilled leaders, and a really inclusive environment where everyone feels they can be the best version of themselves without fear of retribution. All the stuff that you need to promote a diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. So none of this is mutually exclusive, right? Ultimately, at the heart, it comes down to an environment which is respectful. You've got leaders who are skilled, and an overall culture where people feel that they are able to bring the best of themselves to work every day. So for me, one of the big shifts that we've made is, people talk about well-being strategies. And of course, we've done a huge amount of work, Nick, and you've been involved with it to think about our well-being strategy for the next 3 to 5 years. But when we have spoken about the strategy, what it means, some of the levers that we have to pull are absolutely identical to levers that we have to pull. Yeah. To continue to build an inclusive environment and an inclusive workplace. And I think that's where the synergies start coming in. And we'll talk about tools. Tools are incredibly important. Policies are incredibly important. But ultimately, it's about getting quite forensic about some of the challenges that are there in terms of building that respectful working environment at work. How do we do the skill building of leaders? And that's where the focus has been for our work.
I love that. And I think the underlying thing that we're talking about here is articulating the why organizations talk about this topic. Why do we care about the well-being of our people? What is the what is the reason? It's not just because we're nice people, although most people in the workplace are nice people. It's because there's a good business reason as well for us to do this. And then it's about, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about well-being? Well, actually what we're talking about is, yes, it's well-being, but it's also diversity, inclusion, equity. It's also culture. It's also talent development and learning. And how then do we do this? Well, we do this with our strategies and our programs. And then I guess the next question is, well, who is doing this? And it comes down to, well, who are the key stakeholders we need in the organization to really drive these ideas forward so that, as you say, they're not on a piece of paper in a strategy. They're not on a benefits platform, but they are in the flow of work. So who are the key stakeholders from your perspective that you think about as being critical to ultimately realizing this world in which you're describing?
Nick, I mean, it's so interesting what you say. And I read a piece of research from McKinsey which said that around 60% of employee ill-being was driven by toxic workplace behavior, and 14% was driven by lack of inclusion and belonging, right? So it was incredible. And actually, the correlation between of ill-being with toxic workplace behavior and lack of inclusion was significantly more than the correlation with lack of well-being resources and support. And the point I'm making is, for people to really make this stick, it's not just about plugging in a tool or having a policy on the group intranet. I know I've said this a couple of times, but it's so critical. It's really going down to the root causes that result in having a toxic workplace culture or having a lack of inclusion and belonging. And when you start thinking of it as in that way, the work becomes much more strategic and much broader. The work actually become around employee advocacy and thinking about employees as a force for good and how do we leverage our employees to build a healthier culture. So I think, to me, that's the sort of broader context. Who are the stakeholders? The stakeholders to me is obviously senior leaders. Our CEO talks a lot about well-being and the role models the behavior around taking time off. We talk very openly about stuff that we do with the families, encouraging people to bring that side of themselves, that personal side into work. What excites them? What are their interests? We did a fascinating series where we asked loads of senior leaders to talk about what was the first job they had, and people came up with, I worked in a restaurant, or I was cleaning tables when I was a university sort of student. But this idea of authentic leadership, people bringing themselves of their full selves at work is really critical. And that starts from the top, right? You can't have these conversations till you have senior leaders who are willing to share their stories and their experiences. We did a series where we spoke about living libraries, where we encouraged loads of our senior leaders. So we said each of us is a book, and we've got a living library in the bank. And leaders were encouraged to talk about their background. What drives them. Some of the questions you asked me at the start of this session. And a lot of that was about humanizing leadership and humanizing your serious leaders and actually making it safe for people to talk about some of their more personal aspects and what motivates them and what drives them. So I think that's incredibly important. The other cohort we've been doing huge amount of work with is our people leader population. We've got 14,000 people leaders in the firm, and they're at all levels. You've got senior managing directors in dealing rooms in London, New York, Singapore, Hong Kong. We've got people sitting in our footprint markets who manage branches, manage contact centers. So it's a wide spectrum of leaders. And we think of our people leaders as a community that we need to engage with on the overall idea of employee advocacy, and within that well-being in a far more strategic way. So that's the second population. And the third thing is actually looking at our processes and our journeys and thinking about, in the flow of work, in the way work gets done, in the way our processes are structured, simple things like, meetings, what's the cadence of meetings, what are the kind of, what are the hours, what is the data telling us in terms of the hours people are meeting, are there parts of the organization that are regularly working very late hours or logging up over weekends? So leveraging the value of data to go quite deep into how is work getting done, and the way work is getting done, does that build a sustainable, productive, healthy working environment, or is that an environment which is unsustainable and leading to toxicity and this idea of ill health?
I totally agree with that breakdown. That authentic leader at the top, the strong people leaders across the global organization, and then the culture of work, and then how how that can foster an environment which will ultimately create high performance versus burnout. And there's something about the enabler of a good D&I strategy in allowing authentic leadership as well. And that's, again, where the interplay of these topics sits. A group that you didn't mention, I'd be interested to understand your thinking around this, is what is the role of a board in a large organization around well-being? And I guess that links to the ESG topic, and the S is probably underreported in many boards around the world in today's world. But what do you think is, if we go from 2024 over the next 5 years, what would you imagine the role of the board and perhaps data is in relation to this topic?
Nick, such a great question, and I feel very passionately about it. I do believe that while there's been so much of focus on E and G, S hasn't received the kind of focus and attention it deserves. And I've always said, when you talk about S in terms of data in boards and in management team, very quickly it defaults to risk management. So a lot of the S data pertains to, let's quote employee relations case numbers, let's just talk about. And I actually feel the real opportunity is moving S to pro-social behavior. So move away from just risk management to pro-social behavior. Mm-hmm. And that move away to pro-social behavior, that to me also goes to the heart of this idea of employee advocacy, is boards asking a very different set of questions. So thinking about organizational health in a much more holistic way. And I'll give you an example. We rolled out Microsoft Workplace Analytics. So we get a huge amount of data on how work gets done, how people collaborate with each other. But we also get now data on the kind of hours people are keeping. Are there pockets where people are doing excessively long hours of work? Are they... And actually, how we bring that data to the board to try and correlate it to productivity performance, but also other indices which correlate to the overall organizational health of the company is absolutely critical. So I guess and look, this is evolving, but I guess for boards to think of the S of ESG as pro-social behavior, and what does that mean? And it's about looking at data which sits at the heart of balancing productivity, well-being, and asking those right questions is absolutely critical. Even in our D&I space, we are now talking about, to our board, a lot about lived experiences, because what's happened is traditionally D&I has become about very siloed vertical. So all of us have D&I strategies. We've got pillars of D&I. You've got gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, in our case, generational, disability. But actually, you and I both know that the lived experience of a lot of colleagues comes at the intersectionality of many of these streams, right? So, and for the conversation to evolve, you got to start looking at the data which goes to the lived experience of the colleagues. So some of the data that we are capturing now, in the firm on D&I metrics we're talking about identity, so as opposed to force fitting these labels on them around these criteria, we are thinking about identity in the broader sense. And the identity of me as a caregiver or as a parent at particular phases in my life is more important than many of the other traditional classifications. So what is the kind of conversations you have with the board, and the data you take to the board is absolutely critical to evolve the S of ESG.
I think that an important piece, perhaps, moving forwards is to help also educate the boards of the world about that more performance-orientated understanding of people and well-being and DE&I, and rather than seeing these things as a hindrance or negatively skewed, seeing them as opportunities and positively skewed. And I think that changes the narrative, changes people's comfort and interest in the topic, and ultimately becomes an exciting opportunity to really engage with, rather than a BAU topic. But there's a lot of work to do still to get that commonality of understanding around the topic in the way that you're describing it. And I wonder, for you, with such a global organization, how you find the diversity of thought around these topics in different pockets of the world when you have these conversations? Or do you feel the overriding standard chartered culture, which is a commonality across all the regions and all the offices, allows a common understanding, or do you still feel there's quite different views based on different cultures?
It's such a good question, Nick. And look, the conversation on topics around well-being, mental health really varies depending on which part of the world you're in. And you and I are in UK today having this conversation. I'm assuming you're in UK today, but
I am, yeah.
we are having this conversation. And let's be honest, the level of awareness around these topics in the Western Hemisphere is significantly more than it is in some of the markets that we operate in. And I'm very conscious of that, right? So to us, it's been really important that when we speak about inclusion and well-being, and I'm trying to bring it together to make the point now, we actually don't talk about it at a headline level, but get into some of the levers that create positive well-being and an environment which is positive and healthy, because that then starts coming down to quality of people leaders. It starts coming down to an inclusive culture. It comes down to a sense of belonging. And it's those levers which result in positive well-being that are far more universal. So, when we started speaking about inclusion 4 or 5 years ago, we started measuring inclusion index in the bank. So, we measure inclusion index of teams down to 10 people. So, but actually inclusion comprises of a series of metrics, and that includes things like, do I have the tools to do my job well? Do I have a sense of belonging with the team? Do I believe my voice is heard? When I say something, is it heard? So when you start deconstructing this into some of the factors that result in positive inclusion, those factors are far more universal, right? The feeling of belonging at workplace is very universal, whether you sit in UK or Nigeria or, India or China, thinking about, do I have the tools to be able to do my job? Do I have a healthy relationship with my people leader that I can have honest conversation? So those levers or those factors are far more universal. So again, when you talk about some of these things at a headline level, it becomes mouse pads and t-shirts. The moment you start getting down to what are some of the levers that help you create a culture which focuses on positive well-being, I think there's far more universality around those factors.
So I totally agree with that. And I think a lot of this comes down to the language that we use, because so I actually did my doctoral research in Nigeria looking at the applicability of psychological intervention in West Africa that has been evidenced in North America and Europe and India, but had no research in West Africa. So I was interested to know about the applicability and value in that region. So I did some research with a local university and local charity. And one of the key takeaways was it works if you use universally acceptable language. And that's so being very intentional with how we speak about these topics and avoiding language which is stigmatizing, avoiding language with connotations which might be perceived to be culturally inappropriate or insensitive. It can make such a profound difference. And I think that's where the culture of an organization, if well articulated, and if it's articulated in such a way that genuinely sits at the heart of that organization, it can transform how we can unlock the topic of well-being globally in a very interesting way. As we look forward over the next year or so, or couple of years, what are your thoughts on, it's such a hot topic at the moment, but what are your thoughts on the topic of AI in relation to human potential, performance, people functions, well-being? How do you see it transforming the day-to-day work for you and your colleagues?
I'm a firm believer that technology plays an absolute critical role when we talk about delivering superlative experience to our colleagues. Technology and enabled by AI, technology at the highest level, and then of course, where it is enabled by AI, if done well, is able to democratize access and also deliver hyper-personalized experiences, both of which are critical. If you go back to the heart of people's preferences are unique and people want to engage on some of these topics in a very unique way. So, I'm a firm believer of technology. I'm a absolutely firm believer that in HR, as part of the people function, we are product managers. Employment is our product, and we are delivering an experience. And actually, ability to deliver experience gets really amplified by leveraging the right technology. And now that said, the choice of technology, especially when AI is involved, is critical. So we do a huge amount of work around responsible AI, privacy, around ethics. Even is the AI inclusive? And that starts off with actually bringing a diverse team of people who are even evaluating solutions. And I actually feel quite strongly about the fact that that there is a real danger if you don't choose the right technology and you don't really fully understand the way the algorithms work and the AI works. If you don't, there is a danger that it actually goes against the inclusion agenda. So from setting up the right level of teams, co-creating, I'm absolutely not a believer, and you've had some experience with us of buying in a technology and then plugging it in. It needs to be really thoughtful, doing the co-creation. A lot of the big implementations we have done, we've actually crowdsourced from our workforce people who have come in to help play in the sandpit to get us to the right solution. So, I think how you go about choosing the technology and how much time you invest in understanding the technology and understanding the how it works is critical. And but if done well, I think it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, it comes down to that flow of work piece and enhancing the employee experience, enhancing well-being, enhancing D&I, enhancing talent development. It has to be that real purposeful implementation piece behind it, and then the partnership again being key. I think it's incredibly exciting what AI will do in the field of human potential. It's got huge potential value, but done in the right way, like you say. Talking about the future, one of the things that is not that far away now is the arrival of Generation Alpha into the workplace, and a constantly changing set of expectations with generational changes in the workplace. How do you feel about that coming wave of workers, and how can we set up the world of work to be successful for them?
Given my role at Standard Chartered and as a non-exec director in Sainsbury's, I'm quite fortunate to be able to see two businesses very close that employ a multi-generational workforce. We've got markets in Standard Chart where we've got 4 or 5 generations in the workplace at the same time. And that's absolutely fascinating. And some things remain the same and some change. And, so this idea of purpose was always important, but this idea of purposeful work and buying from purpose-led businesses and working for purpose-led businesses became quite pronounced with Gen Zs. And, we saw that. So it was always there, but got more pronounced. So this idea of understanding generational nuances and what it means is absolutely critical. When it comes to Gen Alpha, we've done a lot of work understanding Gen Alpha as consumers. So even before you think of them as employees, trying to understand them as consumers. And the more research I read and more I looked at our data, it became very clear to me how we need to think of them as employees. So, some of the things that came out is they want to consume from brands that are authentic. Brands that take a very strong stand on societal issues, brands that challenge norms. They want experience. They want to buy sort of from brands where they get great experience. Mm-hmm. This idea of phygital, they want to be physical, but they also want to be virtual. And, how do brands show up? So to me, trying to understand Gen Alpha as consumers was a really great starting position to understand them as potential employees. And a lot of our thinking around our employment proposition for Gen Alpha has been based on that. So some of the things we are really, really focused on is they want to work for authentic leaders. They want to work for businesses that take a very clear stand. So they want purpose. They want their work to have purpose, and they want to do jobs that deliver impact. They're all around experience. So, ultimately, it's all about sort of experience. They want flexibility. And flexibility is not just when and where they work. It's also how they work and why they work. This idea of purpose is why I work, but also how. And that's where the idea of well-being in the flow of work sort of comes in. So I think it's really interesting. But what excites me about this work is if you co-create with various generations, the Gen Zs and Gen Alpha that's coming in, actually there's a real opportunity to leverage the power of the organization to create much better workplaces and to build organizations of the future that are thinking about, that are sustainably high performing, are sustainably productive, and are thinking about the right balance between clients, customers, and employees. And to me, that's the most exciting thing when you start looking at some of these trends.
No, I love that answer. It really resonates with me. And as you were talking, the word that really came to my mind was that the humanity, like we need humanity in the workplace, that sense of purpose and pride and belonging, belief, being able to be yourself and feel aligned to the organization you're working within. And that probably pulls me back to the beginning of our conversation, or early in the conversation, when we were talking about that vulnerability or authenticity. And would love to perhaps wrap up on that topic and ask you about how have you found being an authentic leader in work? And have you found that an easy thing to be, or a challenging thing? Or is there any guidance you would give to people as to how to do it moving forwards?
Nick, I've been very honest that when I took on this job, I joined the management board at Stanchart 5 years ago, I had to really think about what kind of leader I wanted to be. And in that thinking, I had to actually unlearn quite a few leadership practices I grew up observing as I built my career over the years, 25 plus years, especially in financial services. The first thing I had to unlearn was this idea of macho leadership. As you get senior, you need to have all the answers. You need to put on your game face. The kind of stuff that you grew up learning when you got into the world of work. And I had to very consciously unlearn some of those things. I don't need to have all the answers. Very often now I get into meetings with my team and I say, I'm struggling with this problem, or I've got this dilemma, and I don't have the answer. And the moment you start off with, I don't know, it changes the conversation in the room completely, right? And that wasn't the leadership model I grew up under, because, before information became democratized, before your technology, information was power. The boss had all the answers. The boss was always right. And to move to the world, which is all around co-creation, which is about showing vulnerability, which is about showing curiosity. And a large part of curiosity is, I actually don't know. I when I travel around the markets, I do a lot of reverse mentoring. And a couple of years ago, I was in Hong Kong and I had a bunch of Gen Alpha who spent an hour and a half, talking to me about the metaverse and, explaining to me the metaverse. And that was it was a genuine learning moment for me. But that sort of changed the equation completely, because I came back and I spoke about that learning moment that I had. So to me, there has been a lot of unlearning I've had to do, because that's not the traditional leadership construct I grew up in, both from an emerging markets perspective, financial services, that's sort of notorious in the past for a very traditional approach to leadership. But the more I unlearned, I was able to learn. And, it's work in progress. I come under pressure and default to some of my bad practices. But the very fact that, you get into meetings and conversations talking about your leadership journey and what you're working on, I think creates a safe space for people to help you along the way. And it's hugely empowering. I talk about leadership is a great privilege, but it's also a big responsibility, but you really want to have fun with it and enjoy it. You got to immerse yourself into it. And I found the moment I started showing my vulnerability and authenticity, it just took the pressure off, right? I just started having much more fun with it. And, hopefully my teams and people who see me in action are able to see that difference as well.
I love that idea of leadership is fun. It's a great privilege. It's a work in progress around authenticity and vulnerability, but it's so empowering to people in your team if you show that authenticity and vulnerability. Tanuj, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you as always, and thank you for sharing with everyone your insights and views on these critical topics that affect so many people around the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Thanks for inviting me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can listen to other episodes and subscribe for future shows wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be back in the very near future with an all-star lineup of CHROs from around the world, from some of the world's top organizations. I can't wait to have those conversations and share them with you in the near future. Thank you so much for tuning in.